and welcome to Picturing Mexican America. I'm Marissa Lopez. I'm a professor of English and Chicano Studies at UCLA. And if you're watching this, you probably know who we are and what we're doing at Picturing Mexican America. We're building an app that uses geodata to display images of 19th century Mexican Los Angeles. And we are having lots of fun on social media along the way. You can visit us at picturingmexicanamerica.com to learn more. So at PMA, we recognize the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, and that's Los Angeles and the South Channel Islands. But we're also grappling with the fact that this space once was, it still is, and will always be Mexican. We're trying to help people understand and experience Los Angeles's Mexican past, present, and future. Part of our process is digging up cool stuff in the archives, discovering things. But of course, we're also discovering that some things are unknowable. There are a lot of blank spots in the past that we might never be able to fill in. That's what we're going to be talking about today with Fred Degar, how to grapple with certain kinds of absence. So Fred Degar is a British Guyanese poet, novelist, and playwright. He is currently a professor of English at UCLA, where I am so lucky and happy to count him as a colleague. So we're going to be talking today about a poem that Fred wrote that was inspired by the self-guided bike tour that Picturing Mexican America recently released with the Los Angeles Explorers Club. There's a link in our Instagram bio, or you can find more information at laexplorersclub.com. So before we get into a discussion of the poem, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Fred Degar. He was born in London, but he spent his early childhood in Guyana. So to refresh your memory, Guyana is a country on the North Atlantic coast of South America. It's just east of Venezuela and north of Brazil. It's a former British colony, and the official language is English. So in the United States, people of Guyanese descent are not considered Latino, but Fred and I will be talking about Afro-Mexicans today. Fred's work centers on the African diaspora, and Guyana features prominently in his writing quite a bit. His first collection of poetry, Mama Dot, was published in 1985, and that was about a grandmother figure modeled after his own grandma, with whom he spent his early childhood in Guyana. And it was notable for its fusion of different English dialects. Airy Hall, named after the village in Guyana where Fred spent his childhood, helped Fred win the Guyana Poetry Prize. And his third poetry collection, British Subjects, that came out in 1989, and that explores the West Indian diaspora in London. And London's also the focus of another long poem, Sweet Thames, which was broadcast on the BBC in 1992. He's written several more books of poetry, including 2009's Continental Shelf, which was about the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre, where Fred was working at the time. Fred writes plays too. One, Mr. Reasonable, was about a freed Black slave who was a skilled weaver that Shakespeare, in the play, Shakespeare hired to make theatrical costumes, and that was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 in 2015. And he also writes novels. His first, The Longest Memory, that was published in 1994. It tells the story of Whitechapel, a slave on an 18th century Virginia plantation. Dear Future explores the history of the West Indian diaspora, and Fred's third novel, Feeding the Ghosts, was inspired by the true story of the Zong massacre, in which 132 slaves were thrown from a slave ship into the Atlantic for insurance reasons. And according to historical accounts, one slave survived and climbed back onto the ship, and in Degar's narrative, this slave, about whom there's almost no historical information, in Fred's novel, he reimagines that slave as the fictional character Minta. So Fred's written two other novels, Bethany Bettany in 2003 and Children of Paradise in 2014, which was about the 1978 Jonestown massacre, which happened in Guyana. Fred is a beautiful writer, and if you haven't read his work, I am delighted to introduce it to you with this poem, For the Unnamed Black Jockey, that we're about to discuss. And like much of Fred's work, it gives voice to the voiceless, and it names the unnamed. So Fred was inspired to write this poem by one of the stories that we tell in our daily life in early Los Angeles bike ride, about how Jose Sepulveda's horse, Black Swan, beat Andres Pico's horse, Sarco, and ushered in this a craze for really high stakes horse racing in California. So Black Swan's victory was so noteworthy because the horse was unknown and Sarko was far and away the favorite to win this race. But also really noteworthy was Black Swan's jockey, a Black man whose name has been lost to history. Without further ado, let us turn now to the man himself, Fred Degar, and his poem for the Unnamed Black Jockey. So here we are with Fred Degar, and I just want to say first, thank you, Fred, for taking the time for this conversation. I know everybody has so many different things going on, and when I was preparing my notes for this conversation, I realized I don't think I remember the last time I saw you in person.
Right. I don't remember. It may have been crossing campus before campus became a no-go zone.
Oh, I think that's right. That's right. But how are you doing?
It's a tough time. I thought COVID-19 would be enough, but the protests since George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so forth has made it a tougher time to be a Black male in a pandemic where Blacks are dying at an extraordinary rate, and brown people. It's just odd to have it compounded. I never expected that to happen, but to have it compounded by another crisis. I'm beginning to feel it's a bit too much. It's my nerves are kind of frayed a little bit. So whilst I wake up and write and enjoy the sunlight and so on, there's a deep sadness to the days.
And I should clarify again that we're recording this on July 9th, 2020. So a month after protests really roiled Los Angeles, and we had the National Guard in the streets again
Right,
about
exactly.
Floyd, and we're still really at a height of COVID-19.
I know.
So you're still writing, though.
You have to. I mean, what else can I do? I haven't got no other skills. I can just about change a light bulb. I can do some certain things. I can cook a little bit, some gardening, walking the dog, walking the neighborhood quite a bit, actually, with a mask on. But every time I see people with masks outside, I think, okay, this never happened before. So I begin to process it. So a lot of my thinking is about living it and being in the moment of it, but also how is it, what sense am I to make of this, because it's a crazy time. Again, if someone had told me this would happen in the way it's happening, I would have said, keep writing your science fiction. But to have it as it's a lived reality, and it's demanding, it's calling out for being processed and being understood in a weird way. So I feel my nervous system being drawn to make sense of it because it's so fabulous and odd.
I remember just listening to you talk, I'm remembering way back in December, which feels like eons ago, but in December, Fred and I taught jointly a class as part of UCLA's prison education program. We taught at a correctional facility out east of East LA. And I taught, my part was how to read poetry, and Fred, your part was how to write poetry. And I remember you talking, I'm gonna ask you to reflect on it, talking to the students about asking them to imagine like a flow of energy from one corner of the room to the other, and imagining the writer as the person who moves into the flow and makes something out of it. But is that, how does that apply to how you're feeling right now with your raw nerve?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. There is it's, first of all, there's the limited temporal body that we all inhabit. It's falling apart. What do we do? And the inevitable idea of a death you have to process, the quickness with which it goes by, the kids growing up very fast. There is that sense of time. And then there's another sense of time that I get from reading, I suppose, reading of past struggles, dipping into data that's really old, of there being a kind of resistance to the oppression that's continuous, that I have forebears I can draw from. I don't have to feel alone. And this energy is not just text-based, it's actually consciousness-based as well, and might well be like pollen during pollen season in the air. I know it's not just for me. not just me saying this, it's just from me reading my Lao Tzu and so forth, that there is, something much more permanent that I draw strength from. And in a tradition of resistance that I'm really glad. For example, I just, on the 4th of July, I read um, the great speech from the 4th of July, Why Should the Slave Enjoy the 4th of July, that Douglas wrote a long essay. It's a speech, but it's a beautifully composed piece. And I read it thinking, wow, there isn't a way to improve on that. And that was in 1852 that he made that speech, which by coincidence is the year of the poem we're going to come to a bit in a moment. but so Frederick Douglass, just by reading his speech on the 4th of July, I was able to feel better about the city and its lockdown. Fireworks were banned, but not really, because they were going for the last month in mid-city where I am here. So there is that sense of there being a tradition that's long, venerable, that you can draw from, that is inexhaustible, and that you shouldn't feel alone, even if you are feeling pressured. So with the pressure of my nerves, which is not a delight, I get delight from reaching into that stream that I see it's not magical, the stream, it's actually factual in terms of the 1852 Douglas's speech that is so relevant today. That's
Yeah. Well, what I'd really like is to have you read this poem, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. And I guess before you read it, is there anything that you want to say to set it up? I talked a little in the introduction, I talked about the story briefly, but I mean, we'll dig into it after you read, but anything you want.
Yeah, yes, what surprised me, Marissa, as you said, we did this prison thing together, and I did not expect to write this poem. And if it wasn't for your library project, literally getting the email in my box saying you'd done this, and then being nosy, clicking on the link and saying,
I
okay,
sent the link because I wanted you to look at it.
I know, there was something about it because it's tied to a bike tour, and it's a very get out there and do this thing, and it would take hours to do. I wanted the shorthand isolation, stay at home, COVID-19 version. So I said, you know what, I'll just get the links in the map and just listen to her. And so I did this listening, and as I was listening to it, there are lots of things you do in there, which I thought was wonderful. One of them is this idea of how do I get this information across? It's quite heavy in places, but with a little bit of irony and humor, which you managed to do to keep it, So I was laughing along with you as I was hearing the horrible stuff, and then you came to the story with Sepulveda and Pico and the horse race, and this guy not being named, and suddenly it all tied into this historical thing of being in a landscape where you don't have being as black bodies and brown bodies. They're trying to deny you being, because if they've granted to you, it means equality. It means a lot of work on their behalf that they don't want to do. So when I came to that moment, it made me go back and go forward and go back and go forward, because I thought, not again. Oh yes, again, of course. Both recognition and appall and abhorrence at the fact that it's confirmed. So I thought your research with the city for the Mexican Los Angeles city, that pre its handing over and conquest or whatever, the taking away and piracy of U.S. ownership. The idea of it as a city just suddenly made me feel, you're right. It's not Tinseltown, as you say. It is this contested landscape, and also this landscape full of richness for how to belong to it, if you care to dig, cycle, look at the signs. So I thought you did a wonderful project of recovery and richness about the city, and made me look at it again without COVID-19 locking it down as this place I can't wait to find out more about as soon as I'm allowed to go there. I'll do it. So I thought it was a wonderful piece of research by you. And I think the other thing I love about it that's exciting is that I always complain about being locked in the academy and how we can be in these silos and this removed place. But you've been consistently, and this is with our prison project too, you've consistently as an academic done the outreach of the work and make sure you don't get locked into that space, so that we could never confine you to it and say to you, grow your hair, otherwise you can't leave. We can never put you in that tower because of your practice, which I think is really a lovely example of scholar activism, which I totally admire and think, stick to Marissa because it'll keep you relevant.
Oh, Ed, you're so sweet. Thank you. Thank you. And really, this poem is beautiful. It was such a beautiful gift. Like you said, silos. I'm sure it's a little different for creative writers, but I write, I do things, you teach, and you send these things out into the world, and like I have no idea who's reading them or if anybody reads them or if they matter. So it's really wonderful to get this poem from you. So let's hear it. Let's hear it. I keep
Fantastic.
talking about it.
No, I'll read it, but I'll say the title, because the title is slightly long, because
Okay.
it tries to capture what the poem is about. So I'll read the title and then I'll read the poem. And it's in 4-line stanzas. These quatrains are rhymed, and I try to hide the rhyme as much as possible, but it helped to get me through the horse race. I wanted a horse racing poem, the sense of galloping along a little bit, because I thought it was a fantastic event. For the unnamed black jockey who rode the winning steed in the race between Pico's Sarco and Sepulveda's Black Swan in Los Angeles in 1852. For Marissa Lopez and her Picturing Mexican-American project with the Los Angeles Public Library. If we can name him, then no one can blame him for the glancing omission by his times. To name him saves him from attempts to erase him from the history that he framed. He jockeyed Black Swan, rider and horse, won against wild favorite Sarco, owned by Pico, poor old Sarco, destined for victory, so trained leisurely. Now, by contrast, the black jockey worked Black Swan in secret at night, hidden in stables by day. Imagine the shocked crowd when the black jockey showed up with the best-looking thoroughbred. Fortunes placed on Sarco suddenly looked shaky. Modest bets on Black Swan made fortunes. Así es la vida. Which brings me to a name for the black jockey who made Black Swan champion for Sepulveda. Is King Midas too much, or Hannibal who crossed the Alps by elephant, or conquering Caesar, or Charlemagne, or some famous face embossed on a coin, or general on a plinth under a horse? Take your pick. And remember that day in California when a black jockey nobody bothered to name won the biggest horse race in the West of that era. A black tradition of riding thoroughbreds began. If I could see him in some lucky audience with the long gone and unjustly dead, this is what I would tell him. Given the chance to set things straight and bring him peace, regardless of whether they recorded your name or recorded you proper fame and reward, to feel the free power of a horse at full pelt and be the one who shared that freedom, to keep it in your heart for the rest of your days, no matter they forget to grant you your name. I name you now to correct back then, to put to rest the hurt of history that saw you as stock. I see you. Say your name. What you did brought your horse fame and left you as a mere footnote. You ride once more with your name in the thoughts of your audience, who see you and the horse, both. You lead by 75 yards at the finish line, and the victors toast the horse and both your names, and the losers curse you and your fame and blame your skill for their ruin and the horse for winning. Thanks to infinity, poet, for your effort in wobbly rhythm and dodgy half rhyme to give me my due, not given me so long ago, at my most glorious, a slight that hurt. You make me feel like a borrowed library book somebody never bothered to return to its nook. The date stamped on me is so old, I'm appalled. The library went south, pulled down for a mall. You found that book and found me in a thrift store or at a country fair antique bookseller. Now you want to give me what is overdue, more apt for your time than mine. You want to settle the score that all the newspapers and reports about the greatest race fail to do in prose. Grant me dignity by saying my name in a sport that's all feel, touch, communion with a horse. It's so long after my time, I don't care if you name me. Keep it simple, not double barrel. For I was never one for airs, never quarreled. I lived to ride, lucky to have the ride of my life. Do what you have to do to satisfy your time and be sure to return me to my proper place in history. Make sure people can say the name that you pick for me. I don't want to lose face with my friends who will joke if they think it funny. Where we remain, there's no end to what we say, what we do, and no ink that lasts long enough to make amends.
Oh, so beautiful. No ink that lasts long enough to make amends.
Yeah,
I know authors are always the worst readers of their own work, but
I
what does
know.
that mean? There's no ink that lasts long enough to make amends. Like, is that a
Yeah.
hopeful end, or
You
is that
know,
not?
well, he talks back to me when he says to me that thank you for the wobbly rhythm, and
Yeah.
I like him pushing back against my kind of sacred treatment of the slight against him. I like him being playful with that in his tone. It's so different to mine. So when he says that no ink that lasts long enough, I think he's talking about unfinished histories, the sense of there being, I'll respond to him, but there'll be somebody else who needs to be recovered from history, someone else whose story hasn't been told. And that even if I write about him, someone else should write about him, that it takes a number of takes to satisfy a trauma or a slight. So I wanted it to be an unfinished business, that my poem isn't the end of it, and that the hurt, once the scar of history is made, it's a laceration. I mean, it's going to heal, but it's a scar. It will hurt. So I didn't want there to feel that the ink could somehow erase the hurt and make it all better again. That there is no reparation here. That abolition is perpetual, and that rehearsal of it is unending. Because history is just like that. It hurts all the time. I couldn't do a Farrell and sing, I'm happy. Happy is me. you know they're not with history. You'd have to be ahistorical. I always felt that the thing about that song is that it does a wonderful job of being in the moment, which we do sometimes. And I think but once you shine it against history, those little minions will run away silently and for the shadows.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is what happens here in the poem, where the jockey is saying, it's such this amazing feeling to ride this horse, and it was such an amazing feeling to win, and yet,
Yeah,
those moments are fleeting. We talked about this a little bit before you read, but I will ask you again, and maybe we can talk about this more. What about the story drew you to write about it? And why does it feel like such an important thing to do right now?
yeah. I've always been a writer of history in history. So your library project, I love the fact that it's a recovery for the community, and I felt that story was buried in it, and in that story was somebody unnamed. Especially because it's all about street names. Find a plaque, ride here, stop, and I felt all the places you named that had markers. Here was someone whose ghost was flying through, and there was no name for him. So immediately I latched onto that absence. It was like a vacuum that was begging for articulation, actually. So that's the first thing. And that didn't go away. That never changed. No matter how much I read about it, I went online, I saw the other things about it. It still remained almost a space opened up in my head and heart on behalf of his slight in history.
Mm-hmm.
So that continued, and that didn't. So I had to answer it. Actually, I had to say, okay, let me write into that vacuum, which is how so much of the historical work that I've enjoyed reading and doing appears to do. When the victor finishes speaking, it's this Emily Dickinson thing of, just out of the corner of your eye, because you avert your eyes and you write at a slant, the very important omission is present.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a little bit over email about naming, right? And the importance of saying his name. Uh, and you were making really beautiful connections to some like protests and chants and some of the things too. And I'm just wondering how you understand the act of writing this poem as resonating with what people are saying in the streets.
Totally, you've nailed it. I mean, it's exactly, if it were just COVID-19, when I say, I see you, say your name, it wouldn't have the gravitas it has for me, hearing it uttered by the demonstrators in the streets who took up the call. It was no longer a black person died, look after it, black people. It was someone died and we are outraged by this death. It's a slight against us. And that's what I love about the protests being so widespread, is that they're saying, say his name. And if you were to look at the bodies saying it, there weren't bodies who you felt were charged with the responsibility of saying it. And I love the way that's widened out, the protest has widened out to become a civic, and it's just become a much wider thing that now can't be ignored. And everybody I've been listening to and reading, they've all been saying Angela Davis, for starters, all said that this moment was different to anything. If she says that, you know it means something, because she's been through so much. But she said that she hasn't seen this before, and that for years people were asking her about their struggles and saying how they felt, disenchanted by the fact that nothing is changing. And she said, look, there may well be a moment when things come together, so persevere. And sure enough, she said, this is the moment for her in her lifetime. And so I think really it is special. We are living through it. And the writing of his story from 1852 just felt like this is not something that's out of nowhere. This is its history, and it goes back to slavery. It goes back to the idea of beings who deserve everything and non-beings who will be charged with providing that for them, that comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, it's one of those things where I feel this moment is calling, everything is refracted from history back at the present in any way. I feel it's a conversation with the present. I wanted the poem to do that in a kind of obvious way and make that link for someone. If I'm not in the room, they'll see the link in the poem to the present. They'll say, oh yeah, the protests. It's really talking about the protests. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that we were talking about, well, I wanted to talk about Afro-Mexicanidad and try to think through like who this person might be, or I mean, obviously we can't recover him, but we can play with the notion of recovery together in conversation. But I want to ask you that question, but then I want to go back to something you said where you were talking about the ride and how, so much of it is markers like placards, even though I talk about the Chinese massacre and I say like there's just this little plaque here and it's inadequate, but there's still a plaque, and that the jockey has nothing. And it was this interesting moment when you sent me the poem and when we started talking about this, because I have recognized that this is an absence and recognized that this man has no name. We say it in the recording, but it just, I don't know, it didn't land the way it should have until you poemized it. Just until you turned it into something new. I mean, that's what all great art does, right? It makes you see the world differently, but you talk about the jockey flying through space and not being moored with the placard. But your poem really did that for me. It made me pause and say like, wait, yeah, this is very important. I mean, it was important enough for me to say, but your poem kind of created the space for me to sit with that. So thank you. And that's really why I wanted to share it and make sure lots of people get to experience this. But I'm going to talk about like the different possibilities for this jockey, which surely, like I said, we can't know. And then any meditation we do is all about our contemporary moment. So let's meditate on our contemporary moment. Because another story that we share in the ride is about horse racing, related to horse racing, and it was just like a little snippet that I found in an article in the Star, which was the main paper of record in the 1850s, and it was just a little snippet about the main story was like there was horse races and it was awesome, and then at the races, two guys ran a foot race, a white man and a colored man, and won a foot race, and they bet $100 and the colored man won. And that was it. It was just an aside, like, and it was sunny, and and there was this and this happened. And I found that so striking for so many reasons, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah. No,
what?
yeah, yes, it's another nugget, another gem, and I guess it's another rabbit hole to go down in terms of what history presents, these fragments. I think there's something about your spirit, though, but you should give yourself more credit. Your inclusiveness, your inclusive spirit, the fact that you have those things in your report means that without being conscious of it, you are attentive to it, if you see what I mean. You can't foreground everything, but you pick up on everything in terms of your receptivity to injustices and slights. I mean, I feel you've done that in the piece. But you're right that the foot race between those two is another example where, oh yeah, let me write that too. I would have to.
But like, what's going on in the world, in their world, right? This is the
right.
1850s. We know California does not have slavery. The Mexican Constitution had abolished slavery in 1824. I mean, it's complicated, but there was no slavery, right? So the jockey was not a slave, and he lived in a world where this race could happen. I mean, I don't know what that means about that society, and maybe he's Mexican.
Right, that's true. You know, I was thinking after writing the poem, I must tell you, and thinking about it and thinking about talking to you, I did think he belonged somewhere to Mexican society, and because of the tradition of blacks in Mexico and the cohabitations and the places. There's a big area in Mexico, what's it called, where a lot of African Mexicans live.
In the
So
South, right? Or I mean, there's Afro Mexicans everywhere, right? We were sharing that article about how Mexico was finally counting Afro Mexicans in its census for the first time.
Yes, no, it's true. So in my afterlife for him, if I were to trace back, I would place him somewhere in Mexico, and somewhere where he has access to a horse, and somewhere where he's recognized as a rider. Because I said in the poem that he has he's in a game, a sport where it's all feel, touch, and communion with a horse. And I just thought that kind of luminosity about riders, and jockeys have spoken about this, how they feel the horse, and they have this link to the horse, an extension of the horse. They are an extension to the horse. But he had to have had all of that, and to hold Black Swan back from just taking off, he would have to be able to rein that energy in for long enough before he lets that horsepower do its thing. There was something about that too, that control of thinking on behalf, helping the horse to think about what's about to unfold, even if the horse is talented to do the unfolding. So I just thought, well, let's place him in Mexico. He's clearly a Mexican, and he's been, since the horse came from Australia. Anything is possible. So I don't know. I had, after speaking to you, I thought I wrote a prose piece thinking a treatment for a movie, just because Hollywood is closed down. I thought, and this is between you and us and you and I and the world, but it would make a marvelous film to have this race between Pico's Sarko and Sepulveda's Black Swan, staging the whole thing, people coming into town, hiding away the horse to training and everything, and just have it finish with this amazing race with this incredible outcome, and people going crazy, tearing up their notes because they've lost it, or buying people drinks because they're suddenly rich. I just thought it was one of those things that was a wonderful story in terms of its narrative and its filmability. It has that odd life to it. And don't be surprised if I write a short play. I feel it's not finished with me as a subject. I do feel it's I got to think about it some more, because the poem had many more stanzas that I took out because it was too long, where I tried to run the race and go along streets and see what he was seeing as he was running, to try and recreate LA. Since I can't see LA because I'm locked in the house, there was some of that to the poem to lengthen, because the race is so long as well. The other thing I did, sorry, before I just realized, it's 9 or 12 miles. It's a long race.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's a hell of a long race to run. And I realized it was a chance to do a kind of a felt or an affective cartography, a felt map of the city
I love
back then.
I'm writing that down.
You know that you write it as you feel it. Since he was feeling the horse, you could make it an emotional map, psychogeography, as it were, um, because LA for me has that side to it. And this horse race was all about that. It was all about this early city, which belonged to everyone and to no one. And here was this DJ taking possession of it in this race. Just as long as the race lasted, he was and the horse, they were the king or the magisterial city. The city was theirs as long as they kept that ride. And I just wanted that poem to be longer. This is, or a movie or something.
Okay, wait, two questions. One, okay. One, why couldn't it be longer? So, but hold that. Two, okay, if you wrote the play or you wrote the movie, like
Yeah.
you could have the race itself
Mm-hmm.
be the frame and the
Yes.
affective cartography, like you could tell the whole story in flashback as he's moving through space.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the race is one of those climactic and obvious moments in a linear narrative, but then there's this whole thing of this multi-layered city that you make and remake daily according to as you age. And how you belong to it isn't to do with the LAPD saying you can't go there, you can't drive there. It's about claiming that space. It's about you saying, you know what, this is my city, and here is a tree that I've written about. Here is a hummingbird that I celebrated. And so belonging is an act of ownership, uh, rather than being told where you can't go.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you have to be careful because you might be lynched if you go there. You accept the risk and you fight against it, and you lay the claim at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And that duality, I mean, it's a hurtful, risky one for individuals, becomes a group claim in a place. If another group is saying you don't belong here, you say, but I sweat here, I work here, I buried someone here. What do you mean I don't belong here?
Right.
So you got to push back. So with the horse race for me, that race across the city was a jockey. Well, perhaps naming the city. I mean, he might have different names for some of those places that he had to run and feel the gradient of. There's something about that I felt was kind of muscular, and possessive of a landscape that might well be resisting ownership at the time. Not being tied down by claims, not saying and so things being contested and so on. So I feel if it's one of those pivotal moments for me in terms of reading and writing. Now the poem, the other part that you to your question about why can't it be longer, I don't do dramatic poetry as a reader as I should do, which is to memorize the piece,
Mm-hmm.
think about how to articulate it, and make sure that the listener would get the sense of the movement of the poem as it occurs. For me, that is a different kind of training, and I've never had the time in my writing life to do that. So I always admire poets who perform really well and really nail it in terms of that presentation of the work. There is a dramatic life to the work without me pushing it. I'm not its best purveyor. Someone else should read it with those skills, but certainly I write it and visualize myself as some, slam champion of some kind, but I'm not. So that's my fantasy just revealed.
Yeah.
So there is that in the poem. So the poem could be longer
Mm-hmm.
as a dramatic piece. It could, I took out some stanzas because I wanted, for the sake of compression, to get the story into a nugget.
Mm-hmm.
And then the long form is possible. And I'm saying this because I might well add to the poem.
Yeah.
Because it's begging to now speaking to you actually. And the great thing about talking to you about this, Marissa, is that it suddenly feels doubly authenticated as a work. It's quite a lonely business when you respond with a social work in a private way to something you've read. So it could the work is dying for the extra step that you wanted to take, which is to do what we're doing now, which is to talk about it and share it.
Mm-hmm.
Were it to remain on my desk, it would be just waiting for this other verification or authentication that the art needs. So there's a social aspect to the work, in terms of a listener, or a reader or whatever of it, that I also value.
Well, hopefully lots and lots of people will watch this and comment and respond, and we can see how other people receive it. But I love this idea of making a movie. It's so great. Or writing a play. I think we should
Yeah.
talk more about that, not here, but like another time, because I'm developing this research-based literature of California in the West class.
Hmm.
So I need things for my students to research so they could just
Hmm.
research stuff for you. They could
Hmm.
be your dramaturges.
Absolutely. No, I'm deadly serious about it. We're here, Hollywood is full of fantasies about about this landscape.
Yeah.
And it's always idealized with the LAPD is always a friendly force clearing the streets for the action and so on. Um, as I keep not, they're my bad people at the moment just because of what's going on recently in the fight with them and tussle with them, and they represent something that I think is not good about civics. Um, and I don't want to go into it because it's not about them this moment, but it means that the landscape is ripe to be narrativized on our own terms. It's crying out for stories that are historical, like the story about Pico and Sepulveda and the jockey who has no name, or
Mhm.
the unnamed black jockey. And so I think by telling that story, we claim the history of the place, as you do in the library project, by the way. It's a fantastic way of cycling the city. In fact, if you see the bicycle as a horse, you could, each rider is,
Yeah,
you
that's
know what I
totally
mean?
how I feel on my bike.
Yeah, horsepower. You're
Exactly.
kind of doing that. No, I mean, there's something about, and I think also people see you in here on a bicycle, they shout at you to get off the road because like you don't belong there. So actually by having a ride the city and learn about it, it's to reclaim those bike lanes and
Hmm.
insist on them as a part, and probably a much more healthier part of the city's life actually in its velocity
Yeah.
rather than, so I do see that the project for the public library is doing so much with history and with how we belong to a space and claim it. So it's going to be one of those projects that will give the library a lot of its authenticity with listeners, borrowers, people who visit it as a communal space. It's very important.
Well, thanks. I hope so.
Yeah.
I have one final question for you about this. And I keep asking it in little ways in emails, but because I'm still chewing on it, uh, and I don't know the answer. What you think? I'm asking what you think. This story says about Black Brown solidarity. The story of the horse race. What it says about Black Brown solidarity, or the lack of Black Brown solidarity.
Hmm.
I want to be able to pull something from it. Like,
Hmm.
oh, this rich Mexican dude hired this black guy to ride his horse. Like, they worked
Hmm.
together, or did they?
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. What do you think?
History is a hurtful thing, and history is all about theft of lives, wealth, unspoken voices. It throws away people, history. So when I go to it, I don't go to it for solace, but I do look for moments of the communal. Even if a person says, I own you, do what I say, what happens to that contract over the course of a lifetime? Is it compromised? Do they have to admit the person can read, have a Bible? Do they, what are the concessions made that belie the contract that they start out on? So with this story, I just thought there was something about the training at night of Black Swan with a black jockey and keeping spies away from seeing what they were doing. It's such an intimate thing to do, to ride a horse at night, make sure there are no ruts in the road that you're riding on when you're training the horse or wherever that encased area is.
Yeah,
The
especially in the 1850s.
abs-
There's no
I
light.
imagine having to make a smooth path, so smooth you have to pick up every stone because if it does twist its ankle, there's going to be a problem, but it has to sprint at some point, just a little bit. So I felt that the owner of the horse, and this is Sepulveda and the jockey, had to have some really serious conversations about taking care of this horse. And the rider had to invest in it in a way for that length of time, secluded at somewhere, I don't know where, had to buy into that idea. And together they came up with something that whatever the uneven relationship was between them had to be evened out by the jockey's skill versus the power and ownership or whatever it is of the owner. And I felt there was something on an even plane that would take place that maybe was seen when he had to say, okay, go ride that horse. and
Yeah.
he had no control over the jockey, and the jockey could have done anything, just turned left and gone to the ocean. Who knows? But the fact that so I felt the contract is one thing on the surface, but then underneath it, submerged underneath it, is this idea of the possibilities that are human to do with human exchange. And so when I look at it, I would see the owner as beginning as, if I were doing a movie, he would begin as quite, terrible owner, bossy, has money, wants to buy person, and thinks he can buy everything, to really respects this jockey. This jockey has skills, must trust jockey, perhaps even loves Jockey.
After Black Swan wins.
Yeah. Are you kidding me? I mean, they would have carried him shoulder high. He would have been the toast of Sepulveda's group for doing what he did.
But even just listening to you talk right now, I never really thought about what it meant to train a horse at night like that. But thinking about the accounts, because there's accounts of the race that say like, okay, and then afterwards, like, Sepulveda draped this golden cloth over Black Swan, but like there's no jockey. The jockey only appears at the moment of the first revelation of Black Swan, because of course they're keeping her under wraps.
Right.
And everybody's like, whoa, and then that's it. But you're right, like obviously that couldn't have been the first time he rode her.
No.
And you get mentions like in other newspaper accounts prior to the race, because there's all this build up and they train her over the course of a summer. But where Sepulveda is mentioned, there's a trainer who is mentioned, whose race isn't mentioned, so he has like an Anglo-sounding name. And then Sepulveda's son-in-law is mentioned as having ownership of a horse and participating in this training. But surely the jockey must.
That's my thinking. Oh, absolutely.
And maybe the training at night was also had something to do with keeping the jockey under wraps.
I think they shocked them. I think the audience, and I got that from what you include in the library piece, that the audience would have been shocked to see a very healthy horse and a black jockey on the horse.
Yeah.
Basically, a double shock. And their composure and complacence would have been rocked by the sight of that, because he was much smaller than the other guy riding Sarko, because Sarko was destined to win, and so they didn't do very much with Sarko. Is my plan for them in the movie. So no, I love the idea too of this subterranean idea of doing something at night. It reminds me of the Underground Railroad too, and some of the things about that, how careful you have to be to hide secrets and move across a landscape in secret. And the idea of a horse being trained in a landscape that it would in the daytime come to possess was also metaphorically representative of so much of Black lives mattering through time, but being ignored in terms of their contribution, Black and brown lives. And so I did see a synergy between Black and brown in this example. I did feel that the triumph over Sarko's arrogance, not Sarko, can't blame the horse. Pico's arrogance, sorry, you can't blame the horse. It has to do with versus the other side, the risk-taking and the chance and the contract. Well, it's all about, it seemed to me to talk about Black survival in a landscape too, and the compromises we make before people see us as human, and then say, yes, welcome aboard, and let's go, let's win this thing, sort of thing. And I wanted that in a film, that would be a moment and a change for the jockey as just somebody riding a horse to someone in charge of a victory. And having to be trusted and entrusted with that victory and in the training. So I thought there was that. And if it fell back to something else after the race, neither person could forget it. If the jockey is ignored and sent on his way, fine. But Sepulveda is a changed person because he saw differently. He saw that. So I feel that people can lie to themselves and hide, but the truth is this thing took place, and therefore it's a record in the world of lived bodies and of a temporal. So I did like that about it. And it's a narrative thing. Appeal to me too is that the histories continue. That's what I liked about it, is that we had so many stories recently about horses being run here and their legs breaking, they're not closing. And so it made me think of that it wasn't over. Look at this on behalf of the horse. Look what's happening at the race course, how hard it is to close it down, even though they have all these horses dying. People are making excuses. So I felt that there was something to be said for the horse, for the need to still take care of it, that we still have to make linkages without a life around us and see ourselves moving together. But there wasn't an ecology of the mind and spirit that needed to be looked after now that is out of whack in terms of COVID-19 and what Black Lives Matter has to assert. Um, and of course, and I don't hate to say this, and I can't wait for an election to happen, but I feel that the rhetoric of the last several years have now come home to roost in terms of what we've inherited, a desensitizing of certain things that we just didn't say and reveal. We control them because they were bad impulses. And now they're being given permission to run amok in the landscape. And now we're having to recover from that. And so I feel that the poetics, however, the meter and all of this that I invest in poetry has a social contract. It has to look at that rhetoric and say, you know what, that's irresponsible. And I must say that. And if people don't like me for saying it, well, go and look at the evidence. So, and I think there's a side to speak that truth to an injustice and not be afraid of the consequences. You'll lose a few friends, but sue me, but it's been bad. It's bad leadership. It's resulted in terrible vandalism of the landscape and of practices and institutions. And it's radicalized people in a way that now means we have to do more than simply go back to how we were, because of the cost and the penalties attached to that rhetoric. So I'm bruised by it, mad by it, but also organizing poems and spirited into action as a result. It's not a passivity in a corner somewhere. And although art doesn't change anything, the poem is not going to change the world. It's or do anything in the world. I think what it does to the consciousness leads to body action and inclinations that are then the doing part of the poem. The poem itself remains this kind of metrical tool that's spinning in its own little vortex, almost disengaged from civics. But the person reading it is given a momentum to engage in fitness. So it does help in that way, in that it sharpens the brain and gives you energy to go back to a site where you're exhausted. For example, I'm exhausted by COVID-19 and the penalty and cause of the protest, but the art about it gives me a return, an ability to return with some kind of energy. So in that sense, I can't stop the poems, and I don't want them to stop. And if the poems stop, then I'm going to start worrying, because it means I'm not engaged. Mm-hmm. It's also a gauge for my own social life, actually, and political life.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. One more question before I let you get on with the rest of your day. Who's gonna play who in the movie? Who's gonna be the jockey? I'm really hoping David Diggs, but I think he's too big.
I think so too. Well, we're going to have to work together on this movie, because a film is never done by one person. I mean, I'm happy to write. I'll need a historical consultant for you to talk about gender issues, and you and I will have to have conversations about it. Absolutely. So it's not going to be a one-person business. But if Hollywood wants to be relevant, we can find somebody. We have to find someone with they have to be really good. They have to be not afraid of horses. It can't be a CGI horse. It has to be real. And they have to be, who knows?
Well, this conversation to be continued, and to all who are watching, if you have ideas about casting for Fred and my movie, please let us know in the comments. And with that, I will say, Fred, thank you so much. Thank you for making the time and for writing this poem.
Thank you so much. It's been great. Thank you. Let's do it again. Thank you.
Anytime.